What's happening, everybody? On today's show, it is our recruiting episode of the week, and excited to catch up with our guy, our recruiting insider, John Garcia Jr. We'll touch on some of the latest SEC commitments around the conference and talk about what some of these schools are starting to do for their 2024 classes. Locked on SEC starts right now.
You are Locked On SEC, your daily podcast on the Southeastern Conference. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And what is happening, everybody? Welcome into Locked On SEC. Thank you guys so much for making us your first listen every day. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Let's waste no time. Let's jump right into it with our favorite guy to talk all things recruiting. He is John Garcia Jr., our recruiting insider here at Locked On. John, welcome in, man.
Good to be on with you, Chris. How you been?
Good, man. It is it's always busy, and things seem to be starting to pick up here as we get closer towards the end of the spring for a lot of schools, and then of course we'll get into those summer months, and visits are happening all over the place now. So let's dive right into it. I want to start with the reigning back-to-back national champs. Let's go with the Georgia Bulldogs. I saw this week offensive tackle Malachi Tolliver committed to Georgia, number 73 overall offensive tackle. What is Georgia getting in this kid? Because it looks like he had a ton of SEC offers.
Yeah, this was a heavy SEC battle. And I think optically we always think, okay, well, it's Georgia, it's recruiting. They're going to be able to keep him in state without, relative issue. But it's not always the case. I think a lot of schools made a nice run at Tolliver, who had a huge sort of recruiting rise from the end of his junior season to this point in the spring. But yeah, Georgia did circle back around and really latch on to Tolliver ahead of Auburn and some other schools that were making some headway there. And I like this kid. I think this is a great get for UGA. They've been so known, Chris, for grabbing these massive sort of maulers, really, along the offensive front, these physical freaks. And Tolliver's a bit of a counter to that. He's more of a polished pass protector, still not small. I don't want to diminish that size he brings to the table. I believe 6'4", 300 pounds or so, but he's really polished from a pass protection standpoint. And that's just not something we see consistently from the recruiting perspective. And I think that's important because you want to bring in the maulers, you want to bring in these freaks of nature who are maybe, your top 10 picks one day, but you also need guys who can flat out play. And Tolliver's already doing that at a high level. He's at Cartersville, same school, of course, that produced Trevor Lawrence. So he's playing against pretty good competition in North Georgia there as well. And all of a sudden UGA's got, one of the biggest classes in the country. And it's understandable, right? The talent in state is always strong, but they're starting to hit some premium positions here along the way. And I think Tolliver is going to be an underrated get because obviously we know they're going to get a bunch of blue chip guys the rest of the way.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, he seems like one of those guys that may not be splashy now, but down the road you look and there he is plugged in starting on the O-line 2 years from now for Georgia. And you're like, well, I guess he was pretty damn good. One other note on Georgia, quarterback Dylan Raiola, I saw, is expected to visit the first weekend of June. He, of course, is the number one overall player in the class of 2024. Have been committed to Ohio State, decommitted. Where are we on him? Is this him just kind of doing his due diligence, going to check out all the top schools?
He's done a lot of it. He's been to Georgia multiple times. USC is becoming a very strong contender to keep him on the West Coast. Dylan is out of the state of Arizona, but then Nebraska, that's a school that he has all the family ties to, dad, uncle, and it goes beyond that. So the Cornhuskers are going to get him on campus the most, but Georgia's right there. And the confidence has really bounced around in this recruitment since that Ohio State decommitment. I think immediately after that, you felt really good about Georgia's chances, but Nebraska's been able to rally from a family and emotional standpoint. And then there's USC and Lincoln Riley, always tough to beat at the quarterback position in particular. So this one's going to be a photo finish between those three schools. Again, they will all have hosted him multiple times recently and since that Ohio State decommitment. So it's really a three-way coin flip, 33% for each of those schools from a confidence standpoint, and it's fluctuating. A couple other schools are going to get them on campus, but really I think at the end of the day, it comes down to those three schools. You go with the pedigree of Georgia and USC versus sort of the tug at the heartstrings with Nebraska. And I think as time goes on, the Blue Bloods usually win those battles more times than not. But there's no doubt that Matt Rule and Nebraska are trying to throw a dent in sort of some of that expectation.
Yeah, it'd be a huge get for Matt Rule, who's just taken over that Nebraska program. If they could get top recruit in next year's class, that would be a big jump forward for them. Let's switch gears, John. Let's switch over to the SEC West, a school that was making some noise the last handful of days. Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss picking up some commitments. They picked up a four-star defensive lineman Jeffrey Rush, the number 9 defensive lineman in the country. I saw Lane Kiffin tweeted out the big fish gif of, hey, we landed one. And then they also, the other day, picked up a JUCO guy in linebacker and Raymond Collins, committed on Monday. So talk a little bit about what they're getting in those two guys.
Yeah, Ole Miss really focusing on the state of Mississippi is to no surprise. And look, the state is loaded. This could be the best year we've covered in a very long time in the state of Mississippi. So Ole Miss coming up positive on a lot of those battles early on, I think is a big deal in that state, and it'll reverberate throughout the SEC. But yeah, Jeffrey Rush, and he's got that sour lemon tape where you watch some of his pass rushing moves and you start making faces, right? Because he's dipping and bending and crushing the quarterback on contact there. He's got a lot of modern edge rusher juice, just 6'3", 250. So not, menacing in a Myles Garrett kind of way, but you think of the new age edge rushers that can stand up, they can come from a wide perspective and then work inside on occasion. Jeff brings a lot of that to the table. May be the best pass rusher in the state of Mississippi, though. Kamarion Franklin, Jamonte Waller, also big time blue chip recruits, still undecided. But Rush was a big get for Ole Miss. I think that was their first pledge there on the defensive line. And then Raymond Collins, kind of the opposite, JUCO guy from the state of Mississippi originally, but just sort of beginning his ascent as a junior college prospect, but got the Ole Miss offer a couple months back and took a trip over the weekend and obviously saw enough to jump in the boat there with Lane Kiffin and company. Big physical inside linebacker, kind of a classic SEC linebacker from that standpoint, prepping at Jones College now. I think there's some questions as to whether or not he's going to try to accelerate his academics and actually get there in time for this season. So that could be interesting from a depth perspective there for Ole Miss, but you can't have enough, willing physical sideline to sideline tacklers. And I think Collins brings a lot of that to the table. Also a strong blitzer, had a couple sacks this year as a freshman there at Jones College. So another one who won't be talked about as much, but an important get because you can't have enough front seven types in the SEC, of course.
Is this the Pete Golding effect already at Ole Miss? Because we know, he's a pretty good recruiter there at Alabama, learned from the best. But I know this was a big part of what Lane wanted in Pete Golding, not just be a really good DC, but also help recruit some of the higher level athletes.
Yeah, and you see the quick turnaround. I think 4 of the last 5 Ole Miss commits, all on defense, most of them close to home in the state. As we mentioned, Golding has always recruited the state of Mississippi incredibly well. So naturally with him there, for good, or at least right now, you see an uptick there defensively from Ole Miss's perspective. And that's really what the doctors ordered, right? We always view that program comfortable on offense, even with all of the turnover from a personnel standpoint. But if the defense can be a little bit more consistent, especially in the front seven, because I think the secondary has had some players, I think it's going to change a lot of that perspective there in Oxford. And there's no doubt that it's factoring in on the recruiting trail. You don't grab either of these guys without Golding, in my opinion.
Florida, Auburn, Tennessee. We're going to get to all those guys in just a second with John Garcia. Hang tight, John. We'll get to more of that in just a second. But first, want to remind you guys this episode is presented to you by our friends over at FanDuel. We know the tournament is continuing to heat up into this weekend. There's no place better to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, because right now FanDuel is giving new customers a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's up to $1,000 back in bonus bets. If your first bet doesn't win, just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That will get you signed up today and claim your no sweat first bet. And then you can wager on everything you want on there, from the money line, point spreads, in-game betting. They got it all for you up there, all on an app that is safe, super easy, and secure for you guys to use. Don't miss your shot at the no sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. Make every moment more with FanDuel. Continue our conversation with John Garcia Jr., our recruiting insider, and we're going around the SEC, hitting on a number of schools. We did Georgia, we did Ole Miss. Let's start with Florida here, John. I know they just hosted last week five-star wide receiver Jeremiah Smith. Their quarterback commit, DJ Lagway, joined him on his visit to Gainesville. I guess from what you heard, how did the visit go? Because this is a big-time recruit. Smith, the number 2 overall prospect in this class, was committed to Ohio State. But how did Jeremiah Smith's visit go in Gainesville?
It went well, and Florida's a school that hasn't been talked about as much with Jeremiah in terms of this flip attempt from Ryan Day and Ohio State, but they're going to be in that group now. And I think that's really, from a Florida perspective, a realistic perspective, that's really what you hoped for after this trip, to stay in the conversation. Because Jeremiah has been pretty upfront. Hey, I'm committed to Ohio State. Everyone sees what they've done at the receiver position, but college football is crazy. So I have to keep my options open just in case something goes down. So Florida, Miami, Georgia, USC, among the schools, Tennessee, trying to stay in the game right now. That's really the name of it for Jeremiah. And doing so with your new receivers coach, or your new and old, I guess, and Billy Gonzalez. And then, of course, the quarterback, DJ Lagway. You can't overstate how important it is for quarterbacks to recruit within their class. And DJ is one of the best, maybe the best dual threat quarterback in this class of 2024. So for them to have overlapped on the visit together is a big deal. DJ's been pretty honest about his confidence increasing in the chances to not only stay in the game, but eventually flip Jeremiah Smith. So even being in that conversation right now is a big deal, because, again, it was a far cry from where Florida was at the time Smith picked Ohio State back in December. So this was step one. I think it, again, went about as ideally as any Florida fan could have hoped for. So now you hover around, try to stay in the mix in time for official visit season, when Jeremiah is going to take even more trips, and you try to grab one of those and stay in the game thereafter.
Yeah, it feels like it's been a while since Florida's had that stud, huge 5-star wide receiver commit. They've had some good ones, but I can't remember the last really, really huge one they had. They did pick up a commit this past week, though, in 3-star athlete Josiah Davis, 6'1", 185, recruited by Jay Bateman and Austin Armstrong. Has track speed, from what I understand, and they like him as a DB. But what are they getting in Josiah Davis?
Oh, man, just a football player. This is a fun tape to watch if you like physicality, speed, or a combination of the two. Reminds me a little bit of Amari Burney, who was kind of a jack of all trades there at Florida over the last few years, but he's a bit twitchier than Burney, who thought he would be a DB when he got to Florida, ended up moving to linebacker, or kind of a hybrid role over the last couple of years. But I think Josiah can stay in the secondary as a physical safety, hybrid rover type. He's very comfortable in the box, working outside in as sort of an additional linebacker, but he's got legit speed. I mean, this kid's a kick returner for his high school. So, it reminds you more of a modern 3-down secondary prospect who can do a little bit of everything. He's big, he's physical, he's fast, he's got ball skills, he plays offense as well at an incredibly high level. So I think this is one of those that, with time, is going to become one of the crown jewels of Florida's defensive class, even though right now, kid out of South Georgia, not a well-known high school, it's sort of a slow burn from a recruiting standpoint. This is one I think Florida fans will look back on at the end of the cycle and say, man, that was a heck of a get for Florida and Corey Raymond, who, of course, has his share of great gets over his career.
I'm having fun here. We're kind of bouncing from east to west, back and forth. So let's go back to the SEC West here. Let's go with a team I think we've talked about every time we've had you on here in recent months, John, and that is Auburn. Yeah. Hugh Freeze continues to make waves. So they picked up a big-time running back, Jamarian Burnett, staying home in the state of Alabama, 4-star, number 8 recruit in the state of Bama. I think number 10 running back in this group. Had offers from, again, a ton of SEC schools, but what are they getting in Jamarian Burnett?
Yeah, this is a throwback Auburn running back. This is a 6'1", 210-pound kid, big, physical, downhill runner. They've had some hybrid types and some speed guys, but this will remind you a little bit more of maybe the Trey Mason era and prior there at Auburn, where you're going to come downhill in a hurry. And this is a great get. Not only is he an in-state guy who Bama and others wanted, but he's one who Auburn led for early. I think back in November, there was a lot of talk, hey, would this guy be one of the early pledges for Auburn right before that transition from Brian Harsin went down? And then it kind of cooled off. which tells me that other schools were getting involved and this thing was going to get a little bit more dramatic. But for Hugh Freeze and Cadillac Williams, who, can do some things in his own right, for those two to tandem here and kind of reel them back in, I thought was a really big deal. Auburn's been able to host a bevy of big time recruits, and Burnett was able to get back on campus as well. And really after that point, it was just a matter of when he was going to make that commitment to the in-state Tigers. So this is a banner bell cow type of running back. And obviously, even in the day of rotations and running backs by committee, you still need that guy who could put his head down and get you some yardage. Ironically, it reminds me a little bit more of a Brian Robinson, who played at Alabama from within state lines. He's just a big physical downhill guy, not the sexiest, flashiest type of back in space, but the production is there. 4,000 yards over the last couple seasons. So Fat Burnett, as his nickname suggests, will I think be a fan favorite there on the Plains.
And you got to think Cadillac signed off on him and said, this is a guy that I want to play for me. So it's going to be fun to see what he does there on Auburn in the near future. Let's switch back to the East, John. Let's go to Tennessee with Josh Heupel. Not really a commitment to discuss, but one that is limited down his list of schools. And we're talking about quarterback prospect Jadyn Davis. Announced his top 5. He has Tennessee in the mix. Reportedly going to make his decision on ESPN this Friday. What are the Vols' chances? Because there's some big dogs on this list with them.
Yeah. Yeah, I think they're in the mix. I think early on, the Tennessee was a major player here. And as the dominoes started to fall, I think the Vols have been in on several guys, with Jadyn certainly being among the most primary. But I think Michigan's got a lot of buzz for Jadyn coming off of his recent unofficial visit there to Ann Arbor. I think he set his top group and his commitment date right on the heels of that Michigan visit. So I think they're probably the favorite in the clubhouse. I know Georgia's going to have a hat on the table there as well. So you never know at the end of the day. But I think Tennessee's got an expanded board at the quarterback position, so where they'll be in position if Davis does end up going elsewhere, they'll be able to pivot to a Luke Kromacek or someone else in the region that's got 4 or 5 stars next to his name. So I think quarterback recruiting is alive and well under Josh Heupel, as you'd probably expect based on the last couple of years.
It is funny, though, John. I mean, I was always told the mantra is always you want to sign at least one quarterback in every class, no matter what. But it does feel weird, the dynamic that you just brought Nico Iamaleava in. He's projected to, they're going to go with Joe Milton most likely this year. Then Nico would be the guy for the foreseeable future after that. Exactly. It just feels weird that such a high-profile guy would be, let me go in there next year and be that guy in 2024, because it just feels like you're going to be sitting behind the guy who's been there.
And that's the biggest, push-pull with bringing in an elite quarterback like that. Look at Michigan, the school that's probably favored to win this recruitment. J.J. McCarthy created that same type of bubble over the next class or two from a recruiting standpoint. But now he's in his 3rd year, so it's that window starting to open back up again, much like we see across the country. So that absolutely matters most at the quarterback position. And I think that probably hurt Tennessee most in this transition from, Hendon Hooker to Milton to eventually Iamaleava, as everyone expects. That's a great point. And it really does matter most with quarterbacks, which is why we could see some fluctuation and pivots very abruptly with recruiting that position.
Continue our conversation with John Garcia Jr., our recruiting insider, and a couple more schools that I want to touch on, John. Let's go back to the SEC West. Let's go to Arkansas, where they just picked up 4-star athlete Noreel White, number 40 athlete in the country, number 10 player from the state of Mississippi. I saw expected to probably be used on the defensive side of the ball, but I got a buddy who's a big Arkansas fan. He was ecstatic about this guy.
Yeah, whether he's a DB or a wide receiver, this is a great game-breaking type of recruit. We mentioned earlier how deep the state of Mississippi is. So if you're a top 10 guy, you can go. And there was a lot of expectation earlier this spring that White was going to decide between Ole Miss and staying home and kind of rolling with Kiffin or LSU. LSU was viewed as the contender, the counter to Ole Miss, but Arkansas got White on campus. He pushed back his verbal commitment date to take more visits, and Arkansas was that visit that he took it for the first time and sort of fell in love, and everything fell in place thereafter. And that defensive staff there at Arkansas is revamped, right? T. Will as a coordinator, Marcus Woodson recruiting secondary prospects. Those guys can coach and recruit with the best of them. And I think White is a great example as to how quickly some of these things can change when you get on campus with the right type of personnel. So a huge get. It's so hard to go into the state of Mississippi consistently, but the entire West kind of has to do it. And this year, because of the depth in the state, I think will be a great case study in who has success in trying to dip into the SIP there. But Nareel White, whether he's a receiver or DB, is a great instant impact type of player. So big for Arkansas to go into that state and win one early.
Speaking of Mississippi, we already touched on Ole Miss. Let's hit on the other school in Mississippi. And Coach Arnett seems to be doing a pretty good job, man. Again, this is a guy thrown into the fire with, of course, the passing of Mike Leach. And Zach Arnett's done a good job. And this, most recently, they pick up offensive tackle and DJ Lockhart, 6'6", 365 from the state of Mississippi. And then four-star quarterback Josh Flowers also committed. It was almost like in the same 24-hour period. But Lockhart on the O-line and Flowers at quarterback, two big gets for Arnett.
And two big humans. Josh Flowers is a very big physical quarterback prospect from the state of Alabama, which is, again, just as important to both Mississippi programs. And yeah, quarterback in particular, you talk about changing a narrative. That's really, if you had to identify one area where you're like, I don't know how Mississippi State is going to recruit going forward, it'd have probably been that. So to grab a quarterback before the rest, before half of the SEC has been able to do so, I think is a big deal. And Flowers is an intriguing player. Again, massive quarterback. I think he's probably going to give a little bit more Garrett Schrader vibes, but he does have a strong arm and is much more well built into that air raid system. Although, again, that's going to be tweaked as well here going forward. But, getting a quarterback this early who's a name, who can help galvanize the rest of that recruiting class, particularly on offense, I think is a really big deal. So great on Arnett and that whole staff getting Flowers on campus early and prioritizing him, because before a lot of the SEC dominoes took place, Flowers was a guy that a lot of schools in the conference had their eye on. So another big get there, staying in SEC country right next door there in Mississippi State. And look, the Gulf, he's a Mobile guy. The Gulf is huge. The Gulf there in the 251 is kind of the most wide open area of Alabama, right? If you're in Birmingham, going to be tough to pull them away from the Iron Bowl school. Same thing for Huntsville, Montgomery, etc. You go down to the 251 and things are a little bit more wide open with LSU, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, even down to Florida State and some other schools. So that's the area where you've got to sort of attack, regardless of if you're a first-year staff or one that's been doing it for a long time. So I think good geographically there for Mississippi State, in addition, of course, getting a quarterback, which is always a big deal.
A quick thought on Missouri. I know so much of the focus, especially through the spring, the conversation was about quarterback. They get Garcia from Miami to come over. They got a commit a few weeks ago in a quarterback in Daniel Kalen from the New England area. But just last week, I saw they picked up Tyon Gray, I guess how you say, a big 4-star D lineman that had offers from a bunch of Arkansas or SEC schools, rather, including Arkansas. But when I think Missouri, man, like I know other schools have big D linemen, but it feels like every time I think Mizzou, big D linemen all the time.
100%. And it's lasted through several different head coaches and defensive coordinators. It's really been fascinating. But, in that part of the country, D linemen are becoming a lot more prevalent. Heck, the number one D lineman in the country is a Kansas City guy, Williams Nwaneri, who's going to be a huge priority for Mizzou and a bunch of other schools. So, the Tigers have everything in front of them from a recruiting perspective there, and their history, when you actually dig into it, like these recruits are able to on these visits, is actually really strong there up front. And they could sell the path to playing time and a little bit of variance compared to some of the traditional SEC power. So that's something Mizzou has often thrived with. And obviously that's continuing here in the class of 24. And another program, as you mentioned, that is locked in a quarterback. So important as early as possible, because those QB dominoes are really rolling right now. You expect Davis to pop this week. Raiola won't last very long before he's verbally committed. And then after that, the talent available starts to drop off a little bit. So you want to kind of grab your guy as soon as possible and allow them to help you build the class.
Two more schools I want to touch on before we call it a day. Alabama and LSU. Let's start with Alabama. It's so weird to look at next year's rankings right now, John, and see Bama all the way down at 14, but we know they're not going to stay there much longer. They're going to be moving up this list very soon. But some guys, or one guy in this class making some noise this week, Julian saying that the quarterback, I saw He was selected for the Elite 11 finals. He took a visit to Bama this past week, and just a guy that keeps getting a lot of attention and seems to be Alabama through and through, right?
He is, and it's not without a lack of effort. These other schools are very much pressing. Ohio State, a bunch of schools are pressing Julian to potentially USC to potentially, go elsewhere. But he's been, like you said, Roll Tide through and through, and he's really upped his stock. I think if there's a challenger to Raiola for that number one QB spot, I think Julian is starting to put together his case. Different player, much more, mechanically sound, pocket style passer. Raiola is a little bit more modern, athletic, huge arm on his right shoulder. Sayan's a little bit more compact, consistent, kind of like what we had last year with Dante Moore versus some of these other recruits that were maybe flashier. You start to look around and Moore is just kind of hanging around compared to your Nikos and some of these other quarterback prospects. So Sayan is certainly a stock up type. He's recruiting well for Alabama there as well, and he's returning to campus. So yeah, by all indication, he's strong to the tide, and he's going to be a foundational piece of that future offense, which is important, right? Because Alabama's going through a huge transition at the quarterback position, which is going to lead to attrition depending on how that situation goes. So you need to sort of stock up once again and reload. And, a quarterback being in contention for the number one spot is always a big deal. And like you said, nobody should be worried about Alabama's team recruiting ranking at this point, because I think it was probably worse this time last year, and they ran away with the number one class, of course.
Let's hit on LSU. I saw they just had a visit this past weekend from offensive tackle Mitch Hodnett, big 6'6", 300-pound kid, and Brad Davis, always looking for some big offensive linemen. But a couple of those recent recruits they had, a guy named Kalaj Cobbins, a 4-star linebacker from Destrehan, which of course that school produced all the Jefferson brothers, including Justin Jefferson, tearing it up in the NFL. And then a guy that a 3-star I saw committed recently, edge rusher named Ahmad Bro, and I don't think there's a more LSU name. Like, you're born with that name in the state of Louisiana, you're going to play for LSU.
Yeah, you're going to be a Tiger for sure. LSU's loading up. A lot of defensive commitments lately. They hit some big offensive marks earlier in the cycle, including quarterback Colin Hurley out of Jacksonville. So they've got a big class, 11 verbal commitments, the biggest in the country right there with UGA. So, Brian Kelly and company absolutely capitalizing off of that better than expected run in 2022. And naturally, when you talk about defensive recruits in the state of Louisiana, going to be tough for anybody to come in and sort of disrupt a lot of that. And both of those prospects can get after the passer, those recent commitments that you just mentioned. And again, you can't have enough of those in the SEC with that increased quarterback play. But yeah, all is well in the Bayou. Brian Kelly and company are recruiting as well as anyone really in the country. And that's not going to slow down anytime soon. A lot of big visitors headed to Baton Rouge, and they just had a huge weekend this past weekend. So more commitments could be on the way there.
I'd be remiss if I didn't squeeze in South Carolina, because I always forget somebody and I get a tweet or email. You didn't talk about us. South Carolina, Shane Beamer doing a great job. 9th in the country right now. They got 5 commits, but all of them are 4 stars or better. I mean, that's elite level talent they're bringing in there.
And really prioritizing those hyper local recruits, the kids that would inevitably end up at Clemson the last 5-10 years. That's starting to change just a little bit. Cam Pringle, MJ Bennett, who was a Tennessee flip to South Carolina. They're keeping guys closer to home there in Columbia. And you really can't ignore the energy, the consistency now of what Shane Beamer and company are doing. Yeah, South Carolina recruiting absolutely here to stay. I would say after obviously Georgia in the East, they're really the best challenger to Florida to be that sort of next school from a recruiting standpoint. Tennessee's in there as well, but South Carolina's starting to win these head-to-head battles there with the Vols. So that's going to be a fun race in the East after UGA.
He is our recruiting insider, John Garcia Jr. Give him a follow on Twitter. He's got 2 Twitter accounts. He's got at John Garcia _Jr. and then at Garcia Jr. Pod for all of his features where he's showing up every week and does a tremendous job. John, always appreciate your insight, man. We'll do this again real soon.
Thanks for having me.
All right, he is John Garcia Jr. again. Check him out. Does a tremendous job providing us all of our recruiting intel. This has been a Locked On SEC. Thank you guys so much for making us your first listen every day. Now you can go make your second listen. Check out the Locked On College Hoops podcast, Locked On College Basketball, wherever you get your podcasts, and they will get you caught up on everything you need to know with all the big games happening this weekend on the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm Chris Gordy. This has been Locked On SEC. We'll talk to you guys tomorrow.